1/3 of Italy could change hands without a battle the worthy of memory. Not gold, not crowns, land, rent, harvest, inheritance, reassigned like ink moving across a page. That is what the fall of Rome looks like when you stop asking for spectacle and start asking for receipts. So, here's the question no triumphal arch will ever carve in stone. When an empire loses its crown but keeps its taxes, its courts, and its senate, who is it serving now, and who profits from pretending nothing changed? Chronicles love clean endings. The ground doesn't. Coins, titles, and property lines tell the missing story. Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Ravenna, 476. Rome is still a name, still a prayer, still a threat in the mouths of officials. But it is no longer the room where decisions are made. Power sits in the damp edge of Italy, behind marshland and walls, where delay is a weapon and distance is a shield. Inside those walls, a teenager wears the most famous title on earth, Romulus Augustulus. The name sounds like a prophecy. Romulus, founder. Augustus, divine authority. The boy is neither. He is a seal pressed onto a document that has already been signed by other hands. That is the first brutal truth of late empire. The throne is often not the engine. It's the label on the engine. Outside the palace, the city doesn't look like apocalypse. It looks like administration. Guards at gates, clerks with tablets, messengers riding roads that are thinner every year but still real. A world trained to obey forms, ranks, seals, stamps, because forms are how violence becomes law and theft becomes tax. Then, Odoacer arrives. Later stories will call him a barbarian king, because that word helps Rome keep its pride. We were conquered by outsiders. But Odoacer's power is more insulting than that. He is not an alien force smashing civilization. He is the civilization's own method turned against it. A commander of federate troops. A man who understands that in Italy, the fastest way to win is not to burn the house. It's to take the keys and keep the lights on. And that's exactly what happens. A boy is removed. The palace does not have to burn. There is no grand execution staged for history to remember. The empire isn't killed in public. It is taken off the schedule. The silence afterward is not mercy. It is strategy. A dead emperor becomes a symbol. A living emperor becomes a footnote. And footnotes don't start rebellions. So the world does the most terrifying thing it can do after a regime change. It continues. The Senate remains. The offices remain. The tax machinery, however battered, still knows how to find your fields. The courts still speak in Latin. Even the moral theatre of Rome stays on stage, because everyone with something to lose understands the deal. Continuity is cheaper than truth. But continuity has a price. It always does. Because if the imperial costume stays the same while the hands inside it change, the public is trained to accept a new lesson. Legitimacy is optional. Administration is what matters. The crown is decoration. The ledger is power. And once a society learns that, once it learns it can survive the removal of its own emperor, then the real fall has already happened. Not in marble collapsing, not in swords clashing, but in the mind. Because from this moment on, Italy will be ruled by men who do not need Rome's blessing, only Rome's tools. And that is why 476 is a lie. Not because nothing ended, but because what ended first was the belief that an empire needs a rightful ruler to be obeyed. They will tell you Rome fell because it became weak. That's the bedtime version, soft, flattering, and useless. The sharper truth is that Rome fell because it became practical. It learned to replace solutions with symbols, to substitute banners for bread, titles for stability, ceremonies for control. By 476, the Western Empire wasn't an iron statue waiting to be shattered. It was an office that had been half evacuated for years, with one clerk still sitting at the desk pretending the building wasn't on fire. Romulus Augustulus is the perfect emblem of this final stage because he isn't a monster and he isn't a hero. He's a boy installed like a stamp. His name sounds like destiny. Romulus the founder, Augustus the first emperor. But late Rome loved irony. The empire that once made men into gods now uses a teenager as packaging. And that packaging mattered, because the empire still ran on the belief that someone was authorized to command. But authorization is a fragile drug. Once the state learns it can manufacture it, mint it, distribute it, stage it, then anyone who controls the machinery can manufacture their own legitimacy. Enter Odoacer. Later propaganda will paint him as an outsider storming civilization, because that story is convenient for everyone. It makes Roman elites feel conquered rather than complicit. It makes Eastern emperors look like guardians rather than opportunists. It makes the fall sound clean. Barbarians broke it, end of discussion. But watch Odoacer's actual move. He doesn't destroy the system, he captures it. He takes Ravenna, removes the boy, and then refuses to offer history the blood it expects. No grand execution, no burning palace, no theatrical ending. Instead, Romulus is spared, given a stipend, and sent away into quiet exile. This is often framed as mercy. It was also a political technology. A dead emperor becomes a rallying cry, something pure enough to worship. A living emperor becomes a loose thread you can tie off. Odoacer doesn't want martyrdom. He wants closure. He wants the population to accept the transfer as administrative, not apocalyptic. And here's the horrifying part. The population largely does, because the Roman world, by this point, has been trained for centuries to obey forms, to recognize seals, ranks, offices, to treat violence as procedure once it wears a uniform. When you live under a system that can turn confiscation into taxation and torture into interrogation, you learn something that looks like wisdom but is really survival. You stop asking whether a command is moral, and you start asking whether it is official. That's how regimes endure even when rulers change. The engine is not the emperor. The engine is the habit. The Senate is central to that habit. Not because senators are brave, but because senators understand price. They understand that civil war is the most expensive luxury on earth. They can count the troops and see the grain routes. They can read a room, and the room belongs to Odoacer. So the Senate does what late Roman institutions had mastered. It adapts. It keeps the theatre running. It helps translate the coup into order. It gives elites a reason to cooperate. Your estates survive if you accept the new paperwork. This is what people miss when they imagine the fall as a single moment. The fall is a negotiation, and the negotiation extends beyond Italy. The imperial insignia, those sacred props of authority, are shipped east to Constantinople. Think about how obscene that is. Not a treasure looted in panic, but the symbols of the Western throne packed up like the contents of a closed office. The message is quiet, but absolute. The West will not have its own emperor anymore. It will be managed from elsewhere, or, more honestly, it will manage itself under new ownership. Constantinople answers with the most Roman response imaginable, a title instead of a rescue. Zeno does not send an army to restore the West. He sends recognition. He makes Odoacer patrician on paper, an old, dignified word that sounds like continuity, like tradition. Like the civilized world still has hands on the steering wheel. In return, Odoacer can say he rules Italy not as a usurper, but as a sanctioned guardian. This is empire at its most cynical, sovereignty traded like a license. And it works, because legality is a narcotic. It calms elites. It confuses rivals. It delays rebellion. It allows everyday life to continue under a new master without forcing people to admit out loud that the world has changed. But everyday life is exactly where the fall becomes real. For the people whose names don't survive in senatorial letters, the end of the empire is not an elegant constitutional shift. It is a new landlord, a new quota, a new set of armed men who must be fed. Taxes don't vanish because a boy is removed. Requisitions don't stop because the Senate keeps meeting. The machine keeps running because the machine is what everyone is fighting to own. And the machine has to pay its soldiers. That's the next turn of the knife. If Odoacer's regime is going to last, it must reward the men who put him there. That reward will not come from thin air. It will come from Italy's land, Italy's surplus, Italy's future. The crown may be gone, but the extraction remains. And now it is being recalibrated for a different kind of ruler. So, ask the question again, sharper this time. If Rome can survive the removal of its emperor, what was Rome? A person or a method? Because once you understand that Rome is a method, you can predict what happens next. Methods can be copied. Masks can be worn. And Odoacer has just proved that the most powerful thing in Italy is not the title of emperor. It's the ability to keep the ledger open. In the next part, we follow that ledger to the place every regime goes when it needs to buy loyalty. The soil itself. And the infamous 1/3 solution that turns conquest into property law. If you want the moment the West admits, it is no longer a sovereign world, don't look for a battlefield. Look for a shipment. The imperial insignia, the regalia, the props that made an emperor feel like more than a man, are sent to Constantinople. Think about that gesture in human terms. Not stolen in chaos, not dragged out as war loot, packed, delivered, filed, like the contents of an office after a shutdown. The West doesn't just lose a boy on a throne. It surrenders the idea that the throne must exist in the West at all. And this is where Rome's genius turns poisonous. It makes surrender look like governance. Because there's a script for this. There's always a script. The Senate can tell itself it is preserving stability. The bureaucracy can tell itself it is preserving order. The landlords can tell themselves they are preserving property. And the new ruler, Odoacer, can tell everyone that nothing fundamental has changed, because the machine still speaks Latin. But law without legitimacy is not order, it's a technique. Constantinople understands that technique better than anyone. Zeno is not shocked. He is not moved to rescue. He does not march west like a savior from old propaganda. Instead, he does what late Roman power always does when it can't solve a problem. It names it. He offers Odoacer a title, patrician, a word that sounds like tradition, like Rome's ancient backbone, a word that implies you are not a conqueror, you are a caretaker. You are not replacing the empire, you are maintaining it. The East gets to keep the story that the world is still one coherent Roman order. Odoacer gets a stamp that calms elites and confuses rivals. And Italy gets the most dangerous kind of peace. The peace that comes from pretending a lie is administratively useful. Here's the confrontation you're supposed to miss. Zeno can't afford to fight Odoacer, and he doesn't need to, because the West has already been converted into a habit. If the roads still carry tax collectors, if the courts still make pronouncements, if senatorial families still host dinners and talk as if they are the custodians of civilization, then what exactly would an Eastern army restore? A crown or a myth? There is also a second ghost standing in the background, and Rome hates him because he ruins tidy endings. Julius Nepos. The West still has a technically legitimate emperor alive across the Adriatic in Dalmatia. That fact alone should tell you everything about 476. If a legitimate emperor can exist and Italy can ignore him, then legality has already been separated from power. The empire hasn't fallen, it has been hollowed, its symbols floating free, available to whichever strong man can pay soldiers and feed them. This is the humiliating brilliance of Odoacer's regime. He doesn't demand that Italy love him. He only demands that Italy continue to function. And Italy does, because Italy is tired. It is tired of civil wars that come in the language of salvation, tired of emperors minted and discarded like coins, tired of armies that claim to defend the people while living off the people. When Odoacer removes the boy and the sky doesn't fall, the lesson sinks in quietly. The empire was not a sacred organism. It was a service provider, a protection racket with marble architecture, so the Senate cooperates. Not because it is fooled, but because it is invested. Senators own land. Land needs a state to enforce boundaries. A state needs soldiers. Soldiers need pay. Pay requires taxes and requisitions. The Senate, the bureaucracy, and the new king are not enemies in 476. They are partners in maintaining a machine that cannot stop without collapsing the social world it feeds. That's the moral rot at the heart of continuity. Continuity is not neutral. Continuity is a choice, often made by the people most insulated from its cost. Because someone always pays for stability, not in speeches, but in quotas, in grain shipments, in forced sales, in men drafted or coerced into service, in villages drained to keep cities alive, in farmers who learn that the empire's end did not end the empire's appetite. And Odoacer has a problem that makes all of this brutally concrete. His army is the reason he rules, and it is also the reason his rule will become predatory. Federate troops don't fight for philosophy. They fight for survival, reward, and status. You cannot keep them loyal with Latin prayers and senatorial flattery. You keep them loyal with something you can divide, something you can measure, something you can promise again next year. You keep them loyal with land. This is where the polite story of 476 breaks down. Titles and insignia can smooth the transition, yes, but they cannot feed thousands of armed men who now expect Italy to pay them back for putting a king on the throne. The ledger that survived the emperor now has to be rewritten to account for a new class of stakeholders, soldiers who believe conquest entitles them to property. And once a regime starts paying its protectors with the soil itself, something irreversible happens. The state stops being a public fiction and becomes a private allocation system. Government turns into distribution. Law turns into a receipt. So before we move forward, hold the image in your mind. The insignia leaving the west, the title arriving from the east, the Senate nodding along, the courts still speaking, the tax collectors still walking the roads. Everything looks intact. Everything looks Roman. But beneath that surface, the question is already sharpening into a blade. How do you continue an empire when the men with swords expect to be paid in the future of the people they claim to protect? Because in the next part, continuity gets its price tag, and Italy learns what it means when a king solves loyalty with a fraction. An infamous fraction that sounds clean on paper and feels like amputation in real life. Rome's strangest talent was never conquest. It was normalization. It could take a catastrophe and make it feel like routine. It could take a theft and rename it tax. It could take a beating and call it procedure. And after 476, it performed its most delicate trick of all. It took the disappearance of a Western emperor, an event that should have shattered the imperial story, and turned it into something that looked like a minor administrative edit. That trick had a workforce: the Senate. Don't imagine the Senate in this period as a council of moral guardians, or as tragic patriots weeping for a lost world. Imagine it as an elite survival organ, a class trained to preserve estates, families, and influence through whatever regime happens to be holding the knife. Senators don't believe in Odoacer the way propagandists want you to believe in an emperor. They cooperate because cooperation is cheaper than martyrdom, and because the machine they want preserved is the same machine Odoacer wants to own. Here is the uncomfortable reality. The Senate needed Odoacer, and Odoacer needed the Senate. Odoacer brings force. The Senate brings legitimacy. At least the kind of legitimacy that matters in a society addicted to forms. A seal on a decree. A familiar title on a document. A coin that looks normal in the palm. You can call it continuity. You can call it collaboration. But if you want the honest word, call it what it was: a contract of mutual benefit written over the heads of everyone who would pay for it. Because public life continues, and the continuation itself becomes propaganda. Coins keep circulating. On some, you still see the language of senatorial authority, SC, by decree of the Senate. That stamp is not a souvenir, it's a message. The old order still authorizes the new reality. The state speaks in the same voice, so the population is trained to respond the same way. That is how you rule a place you've seized, not by rewriting every symbol, but by hijacking the existing ones so people obey out of habit. This is where the psychology gets vicious. If you are a landowner, the Senate's performance is a lifeline. Your tenants still owe rent. Your boundaries still matter. Your lawsuits still need a court that can enforce a judgment. You don't want a heroic end of Rome. Heroic endings come with fire. You want a quiet transition where your wealth survives intact. So, you embrace the lie, not because you are fooled, but because you are compensated. If you are a bureaucrat, the lie is a job. You know which storehouses exist. You know which villages can be squeezed. You know which roads can carry grain. The emperor changes. The work remains. And because the work remains, you can tell yourself you are not serving a conqueror. You are serving order. That's how systems recruit decent people into indecent outcomes, by paying them with the comfort of continuity. And if you are ordinary, if you are a farmer, a tradesman, a widow, in a town that has already lost sons to wars you barely understand, continuity can feel like mercy. A new king might be terrifying, but chaos is worse. You will tolerate almost anything if it arrives with predictable rules. The Senate and Odoacer understand that, and they weaponize it. They make the transition look like stability so the public will cling to it, even as the terms of that stability begin to change. That is how Rome's moral collapse becomes invisible. It takes the shape of normal governance. But the lie has a problem. It must be maintained every day. Because 476 is not the end of conflict. It is the end of one story and the start of another. One where the West survives as a shell and the people inside it learn to live under a new type of ruler. That transition creates friction. Rival claimants, resentful commanders, regions that don't want to pay, elites who want guarantees. The state's answer is not inspirational speeches. It is administration reinforced by force. The Senate's job is to make that force feel lawful. Watch the pattern. When power is insecure, it clings to ritual. Titles become more important, not less. Ceremonies become louder, not quieter. The old language of Roman governance becomes a costume that hides the new reality. A king whose authority rests on soldiers who are not bound by Roman civic tradition, and who expect compensation in concrete terms. And here is where we need to be confrontational. The Senate's continuity is not a neutral preservation of civilization. It is a choice to preserve the extraction machine, because the machine is what feeds them. The courts continue because the courts protect property. Taxes continue because taxes pay troops. Public services continue where they can because public services keep cities quiet. The Senate's Roman identity becomes a brand they deploy to keep society compliant. It is easier to accept a new king if he looks like the old state. So the lie becomes policy. The West has no emperor, but it has a Senate that still performs Romanness on command. And people learn the worst lesson a society can learn. Legality is enough. That lesson doesn't just preserve peace, it hollows resistance. If the coin still looks Roman, if the decree still carries a familiar stamp, if the Senate still sits in its robes, then the public can be made to accept almost any redistribution of power as long as it arrives through official channels. That is how theft becomes institutional. Because now we get to the part the Senate cannot beautify. Paying the army, keeping Federate warriors loyal, converting conquest into property rights. The 1/3 solution doesn't start as a massacre. It starts as paperwork. It starts as surveyors, as lists, as allocations, as the state doing what it has always done. Only now the beneficiaries have changed. So, before we move on, let this land. Rome didn't die only because outsiders pushed it. It died because its own elite organs learned to survive any regime, by making regime change look normal, and called that survival civilization. In the next part, we follow the bargain down into the soil, where loyalty is purchased not with coins, but with someone else's future. 1/3. Clean fraction. Bloody reality. Empires don't collapse first in speeches, they collapse in spreadsheets. Because sooner or later, every new regime meets the same question. The question that turns victory into policy. How do you pay the men who carried you here? Not with gratitude, not with rhetoric, with something divisible. Odoacer's problem is brutally simple. He rules because an army backs him. Federate troops who were already the true muscle of late Roman Italy. These men are not senators. They do not own villas that can survive another political sunset. They want certainty. They want reward. They want a future that can't be revoked by the next civil war. And Odoacer cannot keep them loyal by promising Roman tradition. Tradition doesn't feed children. Tradition doesn't buy weapons. Tradition doesn't settle a veteran onto land where he can eat next winter. So the regime reaches for the oldest currency of power, the soil. You'll see it summarized in a phrase that sounds clean enough to print in a textbook. 1/3. A fraction. A neat ratio. An almost mathematical calm. In later accounts, we hear that Odoacer gave his supporters 1/3 of the land, whether as ownership, as revenue rights, as a structured allotment. Historians argue the mechanics. But the moral core is not in the mechanism. It's in the principle. Loyalty is purchased by rerouting the future of ordinary people into the hands of armed strangers. This is the administrative horror at the center of 476. The empire ends, but the extraction gets optimized. Because land isn't just wealth. Land is a social web. It is tenants and obligations, seasonal rhythms, customary rights, local disputes settled by local memory. When you reassign land, you are not moving an object on a map. You are rewriting who gets to command labor, who gets to collect rents, who gets to decide whether a family stays on the same field next year. A 1/3 allocation is not a number. It is a knife. And it is precisely here that the Senate's performance of continuity becomes complicit, because it provides the language that makes this violence legible. The trick is to make confiscation sound like regulation, to turn forced redistribution into settlement, to describe displacement as accommodation. That's not propaganda created by barbarians. That is Roman governance doing what it always knew how to do: convert power into paperwork. But don't mistake paperwork for softness. The threat behind it is physical. Behind every land survey is a soldier. Behind every decree is the understanding that resistance will be treated as rebellion. This is how states steal without looking like thieves. They steal through law. They steal through categories. They steal through the comfort of official procedure. Now, here's the second edge of the blade. Even if the 1/3 was not uniformly applied everywhere, even if it varied by region, the pressure it represents is undeniable. The late Roman economy is already strained, cities shrinking, trade disrupted, tax burdens heavy, elites hoarding resources, peasants trapped in dependency. Into that fragile ecosystem, Odoacer introduces a new class of claimants who expect a guaranteed share. So what happens? Someone pays. Sometimes it is a senator whose estate is carved up, who grits his teeth and negotiates because losing a third is better than losing everything. Sometimes it is the tenants on that estate, people who don't own the land but live by it, who find their lives rearranged by a deal they were never invited to sign. Their rent collector changes, their obligations shift, their security becomes a question mark. The regime will call this stability. It is stability bought with someone else's body and time. And once you understand that, you can see why barbarian rule is a misleading phrase. The real story is not ethnicity, it is incentives. Odoacer's troops do what troops have always done. They demand compensation. The state does what states have always done. It finds that compensation in the most controllable resource, land and the people bound to it. Now pause and look at the philosophical rot. The empire was supposed to be a public order, a thing that existed to protect the common world. But here, in its twilight, the public order is revealed as a distribution machine. It allocates wealth and security downward to soldiers so that violence can be kept pointed outward, or at least kept from turning inward. This is where the moral psychology of elites becomes impossible to excuse, because the Senate, the landlords, the administrators, many of them will prefer this arrangement to chaos. They will tell themselves they have preserved civilization, because the aqueduct still runs in some places, and the courts still speak Latin. Meanwhile, the foundations of social ownership are being rewritten to satisfy armed men. This is what it means when Rome becomes a mask. The gestures remain Roman, but the direction of benefit has changed. And the 1/3 solution has another consequence that is rarely said out loud. It creates a new political class in Italy, people whose loyalty is not to Rome's idea, but to Rome's land. Men who now have a stake in Italy that must be defended, by force if necessary. That means more militarization, not less. More pressure, not relief. More dependence on the very soldiers who made the change. So the regime has achieved stability. But it is the kind of stability you get when you chain yourself to a beast and call it a pet. And this is why 476 is not a clean ending. It is a beginning. The beginning of Italy as a prize, a ledger of allocations, a place where governance is increasingly about feeding the armed and calming the elite, while the people at the bottom absorb the cost, as if cost were their natural state. In the next part, we follow the machine that makes this possible. Taxes, requisitions, grain, and the administrative arteries that continue to pulse even after the crown is gone. Because if you want to understand why the fall didn't feel like a fall to some, and felt like slow suffocation to others, you have to watch how Rome's appetite survived its emperor. If you want to understand why the fall didn't look like a fall, stop staring at the throne and follow the food. Empires are not held together by speeches. They are held together by logistics. Grain moving from fields to storehouses, storehouses feeding cities, cities paying soldiers, soldiers enforcing the whole arrangement. Take away the emperor and you don't automatically break that chain. In fact, a clever usurper doesn't want to break it. He wants to inherit it intact, because the chain is the real weapon. That's why, after 476, Italy doesn't suddenly become a blank map. The courts still speak. The bureaucrats still count. The tax collector still knows your name. Not because nothing changed, but because the machinery that extracts survives longer than the ideology that justifies it. Let's be precise. Unchanged is a comforting lie. War, raids, and demographic stress had already damaged the late Roman economy. Trade routes were less reliable. Urban life was shrinking in many places. Coinage and payments shifted, people moved, estates consolidated or broke apart. But recognizable structures remained. Land assessments, requisitions, forced purchases, the expectation that the state could still demand a portion of your surplus and call it public necessity. And necessity is always the word that makes cruelty feel respectable. Because the state's first obligation, under Odoacer, is the same obligation it had under emperors: feed and pay armed men. The difference is that now the men expecting payment are not tied to Roman civic myth. They are tied to a bargain. They are loyal as long as the flow continues. So the regime must keep the flow continuous. Imagine the practical reality. Grain is not abstract. It is sacks lifted onto carts, barges pushed along waterways, storehouses guarded, officials recording quantities, local communities pressured to deliver on time. If the regime fails at this, it doesn't get a bad review. It gets mutiny. It gets banditry. It gets the soldier turning his hunger into policy. So taxes and requisitions become more than revenue. They become survival. This is where Rome's moral legacy shows its teeth. The empire perfected the art of turning extraction into routine. It trained populations to accept the annual bite as normal, as if the state were a weather pattern rather than a decision. Under Odoacer, that training becomes a gift. He doesn't need to invent coercion. He only needs to keep the old coercion wearing familiar clothes. That's why the Senate matters again. The Senate's continued existence is not a quaint relic. It is a device that helps extraction remain socially acceptable. When elites endorse a regime, the regime can continue to demand without constantly reintroducing itself through violence. Administration becomes a sedative. It tells the public, this is still the world you recognize. But recognized oppression is still oppression. For ordinary people, the machine continuing is not comforting. It is exhausting. It means the burdens that should have collapsed with the empire instead remain, now tasked with feeding a new layer of claimants. A farmer does not care whether the order is stamped with imperial purple or issued by a king in Ravenna. He cares that the demand arrives, that refusal is punished, that his margin for survival narrows. The most honest way to describe late Roman Italy is this. It becomes a society where everyone is negotiating how much pain they can afford. Landowners negotiate with the regime to protect estates, sometimes sacrificing tenants, sometimes sacrificing rivals. Bishops negotiate for communities, begging for relief, pleading for mercy, framed as justice. Officials negotiate to keep careers. Soldiers negotiate by threatening disorder. And peasants negotiate with hunger. Now add the psychological layer. What does it do to a population when the empire ends and the demands don't? It teaches them that power is not sacred. Power is persistent. It survives regimes because it survives inside institutions, habits, and fear. That lesson is corrosive. It erodes the moral imagination. It teaches people not to ask, should this exist, but only, how do I survive it? And regimes love that kind of population, because once people stop imagining an alternative, they become easy to govern. They accept continuity as the highest good, even when continuity is the continuation of extraction. This is why the fall becomes almost invisible in daily life for some classes. The language remains Roman, the procedures remain, the paperwork continues. The officials might change, the ultimate beneficiary might change, but the structure of obligations does not vanish overnight. And there is a darker irony here. The West's imperial identity had always been built on a claim: Rome brings order, Rome brings law, Rome brings stability. In 476, that claim mutates. The empire is gone, but the claim survives as propaganda for whoever inherits the machine. Odoacer can say, "Look, I am not destroying civilization, I am preserving it," and the Senate can nod, because preservation protects their privileges. But preservation of what? Of courts that enforce property, of taxes that fund troops, of a hierarchy that keeps the top insulated and the bottom expendable. That's the real continuity. And it is why the fall doesn't feel like an end. It feels like the same weight carried under a different name. Yet even this machine has limits, because the more a state squeezes, the more it creates pressure points. Regions that resist, elites who scheme, religious authorities who become political actors, and external powers who see opportunity. Which brings us to the next fault line: religion, not as theology, as governance. Because when legitimacy is thin and extraction is heavy, rulers need moral cover. They need a story that tells people their suffering has meaning. And in late antique Italy, the church is both a rival source of authority and a necessary partner. In the next part, we step into that tension: Arian kingship and Nicene Rome, bishops bargaining with power, and the quiet truth that faith often becomes the last negotiator standing between the state's hunger and the people's collapse. When legitimacy is thin, rulers start shopping for moral cover. Not because they suddenly grow philosophical, but because people endure extraction longer when they can be convinced it has meaning. If taxes are a blade, religion is the hand that can make the blade feel like destiny, or make it feel like sacrilege. And in late 5th century Italy, that question becomes unavoidable, because the kingdom that inherits Rome's machinery inherits Rome's most dangerous problem: competing sources of authority. Odoacer rules a land saturated with Christian power, and not just the kind you can ignore. Bishops aren't merely spiritual figures in this world. They are administrators, patrons, negotiators, and sometimes the last credible voice in a town where imperial officials have become ghosts. A bishop can mobilize crowds, protect refugees, mediate disputes, and shame rulers in ways senators cannot. The church is not outside the state. It is threaded through the state like nerves, sensitive, reactive, capable of pain. Now layer in the theological fracture that makes politics sharper: Arian versus Nicene. Don't treat it as abstract doctrine. Treat it as a social signal. Arian Christianity, common among many Germanic elites in this era, marks the ruling warrior class as religiously distinct from much of Italy's Nicene Christian population and clergy. Because it turns every act of governance into a potential insult. The king's faith can be framed as other. His legitimacy can be questioned not only as foreign, but as spiritually wrong. And yet, the state still needs the church, because administration can extract, but it cannot comfort. Law can compel, but it cannot explain suffering in a way that feels survivable. The church can. That makes bishops both targets and tools, pressured by rulers, begged by communities, and watched by elites who want stability without chaos. So what happens after 476 is not a clean religious persecution story. It is a bargaining story. The church becomes the negotiating table, where power and survival meet. You can see it in figures like Epiphanius of Pavia, remembered not because he won wars, but because he did something rarer. He stood between the machine and the people and tried to subtract pain. In the surviving narratives about him, he intercedes with rulers over taxes and burdens, pleading for relief for communities strained by war and administration. Whether every number is perfectly preserved isn't even the point. The function is, bishops become mediators in a world where the emperor is gone, but the demand letter still arrives. Read that again slowly. The emperor is gone. The demand letter remains. So the bishop becomes the one person who can speak to power without a sword. That role is not holy. It is political. And it comes with a brutal trade. To protect people, you must keep access to the ruler. To keep access, you must not become an enemy. The bishop who wants to save lives learns to phrase resistance as negotiation. He doesn't say, "Your taxes are theft." He says, "Mercy is justice." He doesn't say, "Your soldiers are predators." He says, "Peace requires restraint." He wraps survival requests in moral language, because moral language is the only currency the state sometimes accepts without losing face. This is the moral psychology of late antique power. Regimes tolerate criticism when it arrives as a compliment to their virtue. And communities understand that too. They begin to treat the church not only as a place of worship, but as a shield. In a collapsing imperial world, sanctuaries become real. Not magical, not invincible, but politically costly to violate. A ruler who ignores bishops too openly risks riots, instability, and the loss of the very continuity that makes his rule functional. So even a king with thin legitimacy may choose to respect ecclesiastical figures, not out of faith, but out of calculation. But calculation cuts both ways. The church's growing social authority also makes it attractive for elites who want influence under the new regime. Senators and landowners can ally with bishops, donate, build, sponsor, and buy moral prestige in exchange for protection. That means Christianity becomes entangled with class survival. Charity can be real and also strategic. Moral language can soothe pain and also hide who caused it. That's why the question of doctrine, Arian or Nicene, is only half the story. The deeper story is that religion becomes a parallel administration. It distributes food, manages crisis, negotiates with rulers, and organizes memory. If the state owns the ledger of taxes, the church begins to own the ledger of legitimacy. And that ledger is terrifyingly powerful. Because once a society starts believing that moral truth can be separated from political authority, the state has a new problem. It can still coerce bodies, but it may lose hearts. And losing hearts is dangerous when you're trying to keep a fragile kingdom glued together by procedure. So, Odoacer has to balance. Too much pressure on the Nicene Church, and he risks unrest and resistance. Too much accommodation, and he risks looking weak to the warrior class that expects dominance. This is the constant late imperial dilemma. You must feed the army and calm the population at the same time, and those two audiences want different proofs of strength. And if you think this is merely Italy's internal drama, watch how quickly it becomes international. Because religion is also diplomacy. Constantinople can judge orthodoxy. Bishops can appeal to Eastern authority. Claims of legitimacy can be filtered through theology. The spiritual disagreement becomes a political lever, something rivals can pull. That's the real reason the church matters here. It is one of the few institutions that can connect local suffering to imperial-scale narratives. It can turn taxes into injustice, compromise into sin, and a king's rule into a moral scandal, or a reluctant peace. So the continuity after 476 is now carrying two competing scripts. The state says, the machine still runs, therefore order remains. The church says, order without righteousness is a lie, and sometimes a crime. And the people live inside that tension, using whatever institution will reduce the pain this year. Because the system is tightening. Land has been allocated, taxes continue, soldiers need feeding, and now legitimacy is being contested not only through titles, but through holiness. Which brings us to the next turn. The last legitimate ghost of the West, Julius Nepos, still exists across the Adriatic, a living reminder that legal and real are not the same. And when that ghost is removed, the question becomes unavoidable. If legitimacy can be murdered, and the world continues, what exactly is the Senate, the Church, and the law preserving? In the next part, we follow that ghost to its end, and watch how a king uses legality as a weapon the moment it becomes convenient. 476 is a convenient ending because it lets everyone stop thinking. It lets you point to a boy removed in Ravenna and say, there, Rome died. Story complete. But history doesn't cooperate with clean narratives. It leaves inconvenient people alive. Across the Adriatic, in Dalmatia, Julius Nepos still breathes, recognized by Constantinople as the legitimate Western emperor even after Romulus Augustulus is gone. That single fact makes the entire mythology of the fall wobble. Because if a legitimate emperor still exists and Italy still obeys Odoacer, then legality has already been separated from power. The empire hasn't been struck down. It has been bypassed. Nepos is what we might call a constitutional embarrassment. His existence forces a question nobody wants to answer out loud. If legitimacy cannot compel obedience, what is legitimacy worth? A prayer? A decoration? A story elites tell themselves so they can keep signing documents without admitting they've become collaborators in a new order? Odoacer's genius is that he does not rush to solve this embarrassment with drama. He doesn't need to. As long as Nepos is distant, as long as his legitimacy remains trapped across water and politics, Odoacer can rule Italy and treat the legal claim as background noise. The machine still runs. The taxes still arrive. The Senate still meets. The public keeps living. And every day that passes is proof that Nepos is irrelevant. This is how regimes win without defeating their rivals. They outlast their meaning. But the ghost can still be useful. Because legality, even when weak, is a tool. It can be picked up and swung like a club when the moment is right. In 480, Julius Nepos is assassinated. The last recognized legitimate Western emperor dies not in a grand battle, not with a final speech, but, as so many late Roman figures died, removed by the mechanics of power in a peripheral province. And the immediate question becomes, what happens to the claim now? Who inherits the story? Odoacer moves fast, whether he frames it as vengeance, as restoration, or as administrative necessity. The result is the same. Dalmatia becomes an opportunity. The kingdom in Italy extends its reach into the region Nepos had controlled, absorbing a leftover piece of imperial geography while the world watches and mostly shrugs. Do you see the pattern? Legitimacy is not honored, it is harvested. This is the moral psychology that Rome perfected and then bequeathed to its successors. When a principle cannot defend itself, it becomes a resource. A dead emperor is not a tragedy. He is a justification. A legal vacuum is not a crisis. It is a market opening. And here again, the Senate's continuity helps the theft feel normal. Officials can describe the move into Dalmatia as restoring order, as stabilizing borders, as preventing chaos. Those phrases are ancient. They work because they blur the difference between public safety and private expansion. They transform conquest into governance. Meanwhile, for the people in these regions, the change is not rhetorical. It is administrative. New officials, new demands, new soldiers needing supplies. The empire's end becomes an endless series of local recalibrations, each one framed as necessity, each one paid for by communities that never agreed to become bargaining chips. And as Nepos vanishes, a deeper truth surfaces. The West no longer has a legitimate center to appeal to. The East remains, yes, but the East is not interested in restoring the West as it was. It is interested in managing the West as a frontier, something to be stabilized, exploited, or outsourced. That matters because it changes the meaning of law. Law stops being a claim about rightful order and becomes a language used to distribute force and property. It becomes the grammar of inevitability. Now, widen the lens. Italy is not the only place where Rome is continuing without Rome. In Gaul, another Roman remnant survives, Syagrius' domain around Soissons, a pocket of late Roman administration still pretending the imperial world has edges. It's not an empire, it's a memory with soldiers. And in 486, that memory is crushed by Clovis and the Franks. The point here isn't the battle details. The point is the signal. The last fragments of Roman political space are being swallowed by new kings who understand the same lesson Odoacer learned. Inherit the machinery, ignore the ideology. This is what makes Nepos's death in 480 so significant. It marks the moment when the West's legitimate story stops having even a living protagonist. After that, everyone is free to treat the Western imperial title as an empty room. And empty rooms attract squatters. Odoacer isn't the only one watching. Constantinople is watching too, calculating. Because Odoacer is useful when he keeps Italy stable and respectful on paper. But he is dangerous the moment he starts looking independent, expansionist, or too comfortable. That's the paradox of late Roman diplomacy. You want a strong man to manage chaos, but you fear the strong man once he proves he can manage chaos. So, Nepos's death does not end a conflict. It sharpens it. It removes the last respectable excuse for Western legitimacy and forces the East to confront the reality it has been postponing. Italy is not a province. It is a kingdom wearing Roman clothing. And kingdoms grow. Which brings us to the next turn in the story. How the wider map begins to shrink. How Sicily becomes a bargaining chip. How Gaul slips away. How the Mediterranean stops feeling like an imperial lake and starts feeling like a set of negotiated toll gates. Because that shrinking is the real fall. Not a crown removed, but a world that becomes smaller year by year, until everyone realizes they are living inside an afterimage. In the next part, we follow that afterimage across the map, and watch the Roman world dissolve into deals, tribute, and the brutal arithmetic of survival politics. Empires don't always fall. Sometimes they contract, quietly, humiliatingly, until what's left is no longer an empire, but a habit of memory. That is the real story after 476. Not an explosion, but a shrinking world. The Mediterranean stops behaving like Rome's internal highway and starts behaving like a border full of toll gates. Authority becomes local. Protection becomes negotiable. And every negotiation has a price. You can measure that shrinkage in 3 places: Gaul, Sicily, and the psychology of distance. Start with Gaul. For decades, a Roman remnant survives around Soissons, Syagrius' domain, sometimes called the Kingdom of Soissons, which is already a confession in the name. Kingdom, not province, not diocese, not imperial administration properly anchored. It's Roman government reduced to a pocket, clinging to forms and discipline, while the wider imperial see recedes. Then comes 486. Clovis defeats Syagrius. One more fragment of Roman West disappears into a Frankish future. And here is the key. This isn't just barbarian violence swallowing civilization. It's a new regime inheriting the same logic as Odoacer. Rule doesn't require imperial permission, only the ability to control men, land, and the story that justifies both. Gaul's loss matters to Italy because it reveals the pattern. Roman identity is no longer a shield, it is an aesthetic. A costume that can be worn by anyone with enough force to enforce the costume's benefits. Now, Sicily. Sicily is not just an island. It is a lever, grain, sea lanes, and the ability to starve people with distance. In the old imperial world, Sicily feeds cities and supports the notion of a Mediterranean system. In the New World, Sicily becomes a bargaining chip in a marketplace of power. Odoacer's Italy does not simply own Sicily by right. It deals for it, pressures for it, negotiates around it. Because the Vandals had made the Western Mediterranean unstable, and because control at sea is the difference between a kingdom that can breathe and a kingdom that can be suffocated. When Odoacer reaches an arrangement that places Sicily under his influence, it is not just territorial success. It is proof that Roman power has mutated into transactional power. Islands, grain flows, and security are exchanged like assets. This is the economic logistical spine of the story. When the empire breaks, supply chains don't disappear. They become weapons. And ordinary people feel that weaponization first. When sea routes are unreliable, prices rise. When grain shipments are threatened, cities panic. When a regime must secure food, it squeezes the countryside harder. That's why the world shrinking isn't a poetic metaphor. It's lived as hunger, as unpredictability, as the constant fear that next winter the storehouses will be emptier. Now add the third dimension, distance, the psychology of the new order. In the old Roman imagination, Rome was the center, and the provinces were limbs. Even when the center was corrupt, the idea of center mattered. It gave people a reference point for appeal, for justice, for belonging. By the late 5th century, that reference point fractures. Italy is ruled by a king who is Roman on paper and foreign in title. Constantinople is distant, sometimes supportive, sometimes manipulative, always calculating. Gaul slips away. Africa is in Vandal hands. Spain and parts of Gaul belong to Visigoths. Britain is already a ghost. This is not a world with one coherent authority. It is a world of overlapping claims that people navigate the way sailors navigate reefs. And that navigation produces a new kind of citizen, not a Roman, but a survivor of jurisdiction. People learn to live with multiple sovereignties, multiple loyalties, multiple masters. They learn that law is not universal. It is local, negotiable, conditional. And that lesson is psychologically devastating because it turns belonging into a transaction. You are protected as long as you are useful. You are Roman as long as it serves someone to call you Roman. This is where the moral cost becomes unavoidable. The imperial promise was always a lie, but it was a comforting lie. It promised a single order. Now, even the lie collapses into fragments. So what holds Italy together at all under Odoacer? Habit, administration, the Senate's collaboration, the Church's mediation, the soldier's threat, and above all, the absence of a better option. That is why the fall looks like continuity for the elite. Their world is built on paper and property still function. But for everyone else, the shrinking world feels like tightening walls, fewer routes, fewer safe harbors, more men with swords demanding supplies, more arbitrariness dressed as law. And the shrinking map also changes Constantinople's calculation. Because every time Odoacer successfully negotiates Sicily, every time he extends influence beyond Italy, every time he rules without needing an emperor in Ravenna, he is proving something the East cannot ignore. Italy is not a client. It is a potential rival. That is the unspoken fear inside the East's polite recognition. Zeno can call Odoacer patrician. He can treat him as an official. But the more Odoacer behaves like an independent king, the more that title becomes a fiction that insults the intelligence of everyone involved. And now we reach the turning point that pushes us out of this quiet twilight and into open violence. The East decides to solve the Italian problem without fighting it directly. This is the most Roman move possible. Outsource the blood. Zeno cannot easily send an Eastern army to reconquer Italy. The costs are enormous. The risks are political. The empire has other threats, other fractures, other emergencies. But Zeno can redirect a dangerous force already inside his world, Theodoric and the Ostrogoths, and point it at Italy like a thrown spear. And suddenly, the lie of continuity becomes unbearable, because what comes next will prove that stability under Odoacer was never stable. It was merely uncontested. In the next part, we step into Zeno's gamble, how an emperor restores order by exporting a problem, and why the solution is not a return to Rome, but a new kind of empire, one built from the same methods, sharper, hungrier, and far less sentimental about what Rome is supposed to mean. Empires rarely confess weakness in public. They confess it by the kind of solutions they choose. If Zeno could have simply marched west, installed a loyal governor, and reopened the imperial story with a clean victory, he would have. That is what the old Rome would have done, at least in its propaganda. But late Rome is not an empire of clean options. It is an empire of cost management. It is an empire that has learned the most cynical truth of all. You don't need to solve every crisis. You only need to move it somewhere else. So when Italy becomes an embarrassment, stable enough to function under Odoacer, independent enough to threaten, Roman enough to complicate diplomacy, Zeno doesn't respond with a crusade. He responds with a bargain. Because Zeno already has a problem of his own, the Goths. Not the Goths as a cartoon barbarian tribe, but as a mobile military society living within the empire's sphere, dangerous, necessary, and expensive. They are the kind of force the late Roman state can never fully destroy, because it also cannot fully replace them. It can hire them, settle them, redirect them, flatter them with titles, starve them with delays, and pray they fight someone else. That's the context for Theodoric. He is not merely a warlord in the wilderness. He is a product of Roman strategy, foederate politics, hostage diplomacy, negotiated service. A man formed in the imperial ecosystem, raised on the understanding that Rome's legitimacy is a currency you can spend, and that Rome will spend it back on you if you are threatening enough. Here is the sharp, confrontational truth. The Eastern Empire did not lose control of the West in 476. It traded control for a different kind of stability, and now it tries to trade again. Zeno's calculation is simple in structure and monstrous in consequence. Odoacer is in Italy, ruling like a king. Theodoric is near their empire, ruling like a king in waiting. Both are armed. Both are ambitious. Both are too costly to tolerate forever. So Zeno does what accountants do when faced with two dangerous liabilities. He merges them and hopes the explosion happens somewhere else. He offers Theodoric a prize, Italy, not as theft, no, never call it that, as restoration, as service, as the empire reclaiming what was lost. The language matters because language is how empires keep their hands clean while their agents do the killing. This is the moral trick at the center of late imperial governance. Violence becomes acceptable when it is outsourced and baptized as policy. Zeno can tell himself he is restoring Roman order by removing a usurper. He can tell the Senate, the Church, and the elite in Italy that help is coming. Help that arrives with Roman paperwork, with imperial approval, with the familiar smell of legitimacy. Meanwhile, he can also tell himself he is solving the Gothic problem by sending the Goths away from the Balkans and toward someone else's granaries. If you want the philosophy of power in one sentence, it's this. Empires prefer wars they don't have to fight, because direct reconquest is expensive. It drains troops and treasure. It risks defeat. It creates new enemies. It destabilizes the very legitimacy it's supposed to restore. But if you can point one armed society at another and call it justice, you get plausible deniability and strategic benefit. You get to claim the moral high ground while the blood is shed by proxy. And yet, this is where the psychology turns. Proxies are not puppets. Theodoric is not going to Italy to be Zeno's obedient employee. He is going to Italy to be what Odoacer already proved is possible. A king wearing Roman clothing, ruling a Roman land, using Roman machinery for non-Roman sovereignty. Zeno is handing him a method and hoping the method won't be used against him later. This is what happens when legitimacy becomes a tool rather than a principle. Everyone learns to use it. Imagine how this looks from Italy. For senators, the promise of imperial restoration is seductive. It allows them to cooperate with the East without admitting they already cooperated with Odoacer. It offers them a narrative where they were never collaborators, only caretakers waiting for the rightful order to return. It gives them a story they can live inside without shame. For bishops, it is complicated. Theodoric's people carry their own religious identity and their own expectations. A change of ruler is not automatically relief. It is a new negotiation, a new balance of pressure and protection. The Church understands something empires prefer to ignore. Restoration often means disruption. And for ordinary people, the announcement of a coming liberation is terrifying. Liberation is what armies call it when they arrive needing food. Restoration is what commanders call it when they requisition your grain and punish you for resisting. Because when the East decides to resolve Italy by war, it is not Italy's problem on paper. It is Italy's problem in flesh. The roads that carried tax collectors will carry marching columns. The storehouses that fed cities will be emptied to feed armies. The careful fiction of continuity will be burned into a new reality. War does not care what your coin says. Zeno's gamble sets the final act into motion. The Empire tries to reassert control not by returning the West to its old shape, but by reorganizing who gets to own the Italian machine. It is not a resurrection, it is a hostile takeover. And in 488, Theodoric moves. He doesn't cross into Italy as a tourist of ruins. He crosses as a migrating war state. Families, warriors, wagons, livestock, weapons. An entire society moving with the certainty that if it fails to secure land, it dies. This is not a raid. This is a relocation powered by hunger and ambition. So now ask the big question with new teeth. If Rome is a method, and every contender is trying to inherit that method, what does restoration even mean? Because the next step is not diplomacy, it is collision. In the next part, Theodoric's invasion turns Italy into a ledger of suffering, battle by battle, siege by siege, until Ravenna, the city that hosted Rome's quiet end, becomes the stage for a longer, uglier truth. Continuity doesn't prevent violence, it only postpones it. Restoration is the word empires use when they want you to admire a war you're about to pay for. When Theodoric enters Italy, the old story tries to reassert itself. Rome is returning, order is being reclaimed, legitimacy is coming back from exile. That is the language of courts and letters, the language that makes killing sound like housekeeping. But on the ground, restoration has a smell: smoke, manure, wet iron, and granaries going empty. Because Theodoric does not march alone. He arrives like a moving state: warriors, families, wagons, animals, dependents. A society on the move is not merely an army, it is a mouth. It eats or it dies. And once it steps onto Italian soil, it begins consuming the land's future in real time. This is the great lie of late Roman politics, that you can solve a region by redirecting violence into it, as if violence were a contained substance. Violence spreads. It multiplies. It turns every road into a corridor of fear. Odoacer does not vanish when Theodoric arrives. He fights. He has to. His authority is built on being the man who can keep the machine running. If he runs, he admits the machine can be taken. If he loses. Everyone who benefited from his rule, senators, administrators, soldiers, must renegotiate their survival under a new owner. So Italy becomes a battlefield not just of armies, but of institutions fighting to keep their routines alive. And routines don't survive war kindly. Early clashes and advances create the first wave of logistical collapse. Villages caught near marching routes are drained. Livestock are seized. Grain is requisitioned, first with orders, then with threats, then with violence when orders aren't enough. Roads that once carried tax wagons now carry refugees. You can tell this story as a sequence of battles. That's what textbooks do. But the real engine of suffering is the siege, because siege is what happens when rulers want to control a city without destroying its value. Siege is administrative violence, starvation applied as policy, and Ravenna is the perfect place for that violence. Marshy, fortified, stubborn, a city built to resist sudden collapse. It had been the stage for Rome's quiet end in 476. Now it becomes the stage for the lie of quiet continuity being exposed. Because no matter what titles the East grants, no matter what coins the Senate stamps, war reduces all authority to one question: who controls food? As the conflict drags on, Italy's social fabric begins to tear in predictable ways. Elites hedge. Some try to stay loyal to Odoacer, hoping continuity will protect them. Others begin to signal toward Theodoric, calculating that the next regime will remember who opened gates early and who resisted too long. Institutions turn into weather vanes. Morality becomes timing. This is the political psychology of civil conflict in a collapsing world. You don't choose sides because you believe. You choose because you want to live. And ordinary people, those without letters, seals, or armies, are forced into complicity by hunger. A town feeds whichever troops stand outside its walls. A farmer hides grain until he can't. A family bargains with soldiers for protection and pays with food they can't spare. The war trains everyone to see survival as negotiation with violence. Theodoric's campaign is not simply a clash of two leaders. It is a collision between two versions of Rome as method. Odoacer learned to inherit the machine and keep it running. Theodoric is here to do the same, only with a larger migrating base and a deeper claim to legitimacy from the east. Both men understand that the prize is not the crown. The prize is the ability to command Italy's resources without constant rebellion. And that is why the war becomes long, because neither side can afford a quick collapse. A quick collapse means a loss of legitimacy, a loss of bargaining power, a loss of credibility, with soldiers who are watching to see whether their leader can provide. If Odoacer looks weak, his supporters fracture. If Theodoric looks stalled, his migrating society becomes desperate, desperation that turns into predation. So Italy pays for the delay, and Ravenna pays the most. A siege doesn't just starve bodies, it starves trust. It turns neighbors into informants. It makes bread political. It forces the city to decide who gets to eat first. Soldiers, officials, children, the sick. And every choice plants resentment that outlives the war. This is the hidden horror behind continuity. Continuity taught Italy to obey the machine, but in war, the machine becomes a weapon. Whoever owns it can decide which districts receive supplies, which roads remain open, which communities are punished by neglect. Starvation becomes policy, not accident. Eventually, exhaustion does what ideology cannot. Negotiations begin. Settlements are discussed. A deal is reached that looks like compromise, a shared rule, an agreement, an end to bloodshed. The language is calm again. Paper returns. People breathe, believing perhaps the worst has passed. And this is where the story becomes truly Roman. Because Rome always knew that violence and ritual belong together. That the cleanest way to end a rival is not always in battle, but in ceremony, in a banquet, in a moment where trust is required, so that betrayal can be decisive. Ravenna, the city of marsh and delay, is about to witness the final act of late imperial politics, the administrative execution disguised as reconciliation, the kind of killing that does not announce itself as murder, but as the restoration of order. In the next part, we reach 493, the settlement, the banquet, and the moment the Italian machine changes hands again. And we finally answer the big question. If an empire can survive without an emperor, what actually died? And what, horrifyingly, lived on? If you want to see what Rome became at the end, don't look for ruins. Look for a table set for peace. Because the final act of the Western Empire is not an apocalypse. It is a negotiation, a settlement, a ritual designed to make violence look like closure. By 493, Italy is exhausted. Years of war have turned restoration into a synonym for hunger. Theodoric has pressed in. Odoacer has held out. Cities have learned what siege teaches best, that law is meaningless when food is controlled by men with spears. And when exhaustion finally forces agreement, it arrives in the language of civilized solutions, shared rule, reconciliation, legitimacy reassembled through paperwork. A treaty is a performance. It tells the population, the nightmare has ended because the authorities have spoken. It tells soldiers, you will be paid because the state will exist tomorrow. It tells elites, your property will be recognized again. It tells the church, peace is possible, so preach endurance and restraint. And for a moment, people want to believe it. Not because they are foolish, because belief is cheaper than fear. Then the banquet happens. Theodoric and Odoacer dine together in Ravenna. The setting is almost obscene in its symbolism. A city that once hosted the quiet deposition of a boy emperor now hosts the quiet elimination of a king. The meal is the perfect Roman stage, hospitality, ritual, a public-facing gesture of unity. It is designed to look like the return of civilized order. And then Odoacer is killed. Not in open battle where men can call it fate. Not in a chaotic riot where guilt can dissolve into confusion. He is killed in the controlled environment of ceremony, where trust is required, where witnesses can be managed, where the narrative can be shaped immediately afterward. This is why the method matters. It's not just that Odoacer dies. It's how he dies, as an administrative obstacle, removed at the exact moment his removal creates the least instability and the most legitimacy for the new ruler. Theodoric does not merely win Italy, he claims the right to stabilize it. And that claim is what every successor to Rome wants more than territory, the right to call their violence order. Now we can finally close the loop we opened in part 1. When an empire loses its crown but keeps its taxes, its courts, and its senate, who is it serving now, and who profits from pretending nothing changed? The answer is not the people, not primarily. The machine is serving whoever can seize it and keep it running. The machine is serving those who benefit from predictable extraction. Soldiers who demand payment, elites who demand property enforcement, administrators who demand salaries, and rulers who demand obedience disguised as normal life. Rome did not fall because barbarians hated civilization. Rome fell because the civilization it built was a system that could be inherited by anyone ruthless enough to preserve its functions. That is the horrifying legacy. The empire taught the world how to rule without being loved. And it taught something even darker. Legitimacy is optional if your institutions remain credible. People will obey the stamp even when they no longer believe in the hand that holds it. They will cooperate with a lie if the lie protects their property, their status, or simply their chance to survive another winter. That is what truly died in the 5th century. Not marble, not Latin, not the Senate as a social club. What died was the belief that law is anchored in rightful authority. Once that belief dissolves, law becomes portable. It becomes a tool that can be wielded by any regime that can maintain the appearance of continuity. Theodoric's victory doesn't reverse the fall, it completes it, because he inherits the Italian machine and runs it with greater competence, sharper discipline, and a longer horizon. He presents himself as the guardian of Roman order while building a Gothic kingship rooted in Italian resources. He shows the final form of the post-imperial world, not Rome resurrected, but Rome refitted. Administration without emperor, legitimacy outsourced, violence hidden behind procedure. And notice what this means for everyone who isn't sitting at the banquet. For the small landowners and tenants whose lives were already being reshaped by land allocations, this is not a philosophical crisis. It is material. Every transfer of power redraws obligations. Every new ruler reinterprets rights. Every war rearranges who gets to eat first. The machine is stable only in one sense. It consistently demands payment from those least able to refuse. So if you came here expecting a simple moral, Rome fell because it was decadent, because it was weak, because it deserved it. Throw that away. The truth is uglier and more useful. Rome fell because it proved you can remove the crown and keep the system. And once the world learned that trick, the empire's end became less dramatic than its survival. That is the final irony. The West's imperial line ends with a boy sent into exile and a king murdered at dinner. Not the grand collapse of legend, a bureaucratic extinction, quiet enough that the paperwork barely paused. And yet, the consequences were not quiet. They were lived for centuries, in shrinking horizons, in negotiated loyalties, in laws that served power more than justice, and in a civilization that kept calling itself order, even as it redistributed suffering with administrative precision. So remember 476 the right way, not as the day Rome fell, As the day Rome proved, it could be worn. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.